is the right time to stand up for freedom? Could it be when you start to feel creating children who'll inherit the pain and the debt of this nation and be slaves to the banks that cause hyperinflation, who are masters of commerce, lies, and bad legislation? Whoa, if you looked in the eyes of 1,000 young children through fences of razors, their innocence stolen as the red flag of tyranny flies in the open, is that when you finally notice? Whoa, whoa, but I'm only a stranger here. I'm a long, long way from my home, and they say I can't change all the things I find strange, for what can one man do alone?
Hi, and welcome back to the Liberty Test, everyone. Tonight, I'm your host, Dan Castello, and I'm joined by Robert Schuon, Karyn Thompson, and Rose Leatherman. We're all libertarians, and we're going to be doing the Liberty Test tonight, which is, of course, where we take a government action or policy and we run it through the party platform of the New York State Libertarian Party just to see whether whatever the government is doing is something a good libertarian would do, or at least could get on board with. Tonight's conversation is going to be a little challenging because we're talking about the prison workers' strike, and that brings up a whole lot of issues. So before I get into that, I'm just going to give a briefing on what my research shows is the latest as of March 26th, 2025. So the New York prison workers' strike, which was an action by corrections officers, or COs, not sanctioned by their union, by the way. It began on February 17th, and it ended on March 10th. So I think that was 22 days. Someone check my math. But anyway, it was sparked by grievances over severe staffing shortages, mandatory overtime, often 24-hour shifts, and what were perceived by the COs anyway as unsafe conditions that they linked to the 2021 HALT Act, H-A-L-T, which limited the use of solitary confinement. And they said created problems disciplining prisoners, and that made everybody less safe, including the prisoners. So the problem is the strike disrupted 38 of the state's 42 prisons, and Governor Kathy Hochul responded by deploying over 6,000 National Guard troops to maintain order. She filed injunctions under the Taylor Law, which, if I understand correctly, bans public employee strikes, and she tried to pursue mediation. After, I think, 4 failed agreements, there was a final deal on March 8th, which offered concessions. So as of that time, that included a 90-day suspension of HALT's programming requirements, 2.5 times overtime pay for 30 days, and no discipline for returning strikers by March 10th. So about 10,000 of the 13,500 COs returned as of the last time I checked, but 2,000 who didn't were fired and were barred from state jobs via Hochul's March 11th executive order, which also recommended their removal from the police and peace officer registry. And I'm just checking real quick, as of the latest today, there's still some tensions. Hochul is pushing, quote, a recover, recruit, and rebuild plan, boosting CO recruitment, so academy trainees and social media campaigns and stuff, while attempting to defend her hardline stance. I think somebody quoted her, I can't verify this, as there are consequences when people break the law. But critics, including Assemblyman Billy Jones, call the job ban an overreach, and 3 fired COs actually joined Rensselaer County's Sheriff's Office, which showed local hiring defiance, something libertarians are generally in favor of. Advocates for the HALT Act have been decrying its suspension, arguing it undermines humane prison reform, while COs and families demand its full repeal, so they're not happy with the compromise, and they're citing increased violence. Examples include the inmate deaths at Marcy and mid-state facilities, which are currently under investigation. So again, the latest is that the state is navigating the whole post-strike staffing and the safety challenges amid a lot of political pressure. So this is a real mess. It's brave of us to be wading into this, and I don't feel like there's any great libertarian solutions that wouldn't involve starting from scratch. But Bob, I want to throw it to you. What do you think about all this?
Well, let me give you a little background of how all this goes down because the the when the guards went on strike, the New York State Taylor law says that that is an illegal act. Okay, the Taylor law basically prohibits strikes by public employees. This is right from the New York State the New York State website. Grants them union status. They can form unions. They're kind of stuck with it. You have to join the union. You can't not be in the union. Requires the state to negotiate with them. Well, yeah, they would have to anyway. Um, but then what it does is it basically imposes a whole structure on the negotiations that basically gives the state the power to say, well, if you don't take what we want, we'll just go through the arbitration, which because in that case it's not really arbitration, it's a whole thing. And this is kind of illustrated by the sequence of events that happen because there's so many bad things. So the first headline I have here, which is pretty interesting: Hochul endangering National Guard with indefinite prison duty amid corrections strike, state lawmaker. Okay, that was 20 days before today. Then the second headline is, with most prison guards, New York prison guards ending strike, Hochul bars holdouts from state jobs. So that's pretty much just retribution here. Then you've got 2,000 fired prison guards won't be hired by New York again, Hochul says. That's 14 days ago. So 2 weeks ago. Then 2 days ago, Hochul softened stance on state correction officers returning to law enforcement, meaning like when the COs joined Rensselaer, you said it was, I believe. And then yesterday, there is state facing lawsuits from central New York counties will let counties hire fired state prison guards. So the state, like, it becomes very difficult to believe that the state is negotiating fairly here. But on top of that, one of the things that, as libertarians, if it was a perfect libertarian world, okay, we wouldn't need state prisons per se. However, we live in a world where things are not perfect, and the state is, at least on paper, tasked with protecting citizens' rights. So if somebody violates those rules, that is given to the state. Now, I'm not advocating one way or the other. That is the way things actually are. And the state, because it controls violence, because it has a monopoly on violence, is the one that is tasked with incarcerating people who break the law. That's the way the system is now. The problem being, now we have prisons that are for profit, which, again, it's bad enough that the state is doing it, but they can't actually do it adequately, so they job it out to a third party. And if you're making money on something, you want to keep making money on that something. So that raises a whole other series of issues. The other problem is, of course, that HALT Act, which the HALT Act basically limits the amount of solitary confinement. So here's an article from the New York State Senate that says limits the use of segregated confinement for incarcerated persons to 15 days, implements alternative rehabilitative measures, including the creation of residential rehabilitation units, which that's an interesting term, expands the definition of segregated confinement, and eliminates the use of segregated confinement for vulnerable incarcerated populations. Which, that's a phrase if I ever heard one. Only a politician could come up with a phrase like that.
You know what's the most interesting thing of all of that is that Kathy Hochul went on the record very publicly saying that she was putting her National Guard members in danger, sending them into the prisons, not really realizing how silly that sounds, that somehow the COs were never in danger, which was a lot of the reason for their striking.
Well, gee, I wonder why the prisons are supposedly unsafe. Could possibly be because they're overcrowded and they tend to increase poor behaviors and violent behaviors by the people who are incarcerated.
Isn't that the reason they needed the solitary confinement tool in their belt?
Sure, this has been like psychologists, have pretty much there's the consensus is that solitary confinement is a form of torture if it's sustained, and that it should only be used in cases where a person is genuinely a danger to themselves or others and needs to be separated from other people.
Wait, I've heard that phrase
Punishment.
somewhere before. Wait a minute. Isn't that mental health issue? That's right. Isn't it you get confined in a mental institution if you're a danger to yourself or others? Yeah, I thought that was the phrase.
Right.
Yes, solitary confinement is not something that should be used as a punishment, because the effect that it has on the mind of sustained isolation. If you can listen to interviews with people who were subjected to solitary confinement for prolonged amounts of time, it has lasting negative effects that will last for years.
I can imagine.
This is the problem.
The complaint, they're going on, the striking prison workers, that's their main complaint. Oh, well, without the threat of solitary confinement, we can't get the prisoners to behave. Okay, I think that may be the case, but they shouldn't. That should not be their only crutch to get the prisoners to do what they want.
It sounds like the state, though, is attempting to enforce our point of view. They're trying to limit something that we view as problematic, and they're getting resistance from the people who have to actually do the job and have firsthand experience. And that's one of the reasons why they're striking. They actually claim it makes everybody less safe, including the prisoners themselves.
I think the issue is that the prisons are overcrowded, that they don't have the resources to properly deal with each prisoner. Most of this comes down to the fact that, okay, why are the prisons overcrowded? Because of the number of laws on the books, because of the number of people who are locked up for victimless crimes, or even in cases where they have committed crimes that did have victims, but could potentially be better served by rehabilitation or job-sustaining programs, the ability to do something else with their lives. They're instead being incarcerated, which not only does it not help the people, but this probably is the reason why they don't have the resources to properly address the problems in the prison, so they're relying on solitary confinement as punishment to enforce compliance, when in actuality they're dealing with an overcrowded prison.
So you're saying they need more tax dollars or more federal grants?
Dumping money into it is that's always the answer.
It's not only a problem for the corrections officers and the prisoners; it's a societal problem too, because we have such a high rate of reoffenders. Even people who have served time, they don't come out deterred. Seemingly, right? Because they reoffend so often. I mean, if we spent the money we were already spending, right, on more enrichment, rehabilitation, job programs, things like that, we wouldn't have the reoffenders, and the prison population would decline immediately, I think.
But
right.
New York,
go ahead.
The problem is that in New York State, once you're declared an offender and you've gone to prison, your life's over. You know what I mean? You could literally say to get employed in New York with a prison record is well nigh impossible. Maybe you'll find that 1% of people who will give you another chance. But especially once you've been in a New York State prison, the prison system in New York State is so violent and so soul destroying, I guess the word would be for it, that the people that actually get released have been ruined. You know what I mean? It's the first thing they're going to do is just go out and offend again because they have no money, they have no job prospects, they have no house, no place to live. They have no job and no prospect of getting one. So what exactly does the state expect to happen with these people? Literally toss them out on the street with maybe a few dollars. I don't even know what the release system is like nowadays, but it's not good, and then what future is there of, and then the claim is, we need more laws on the books. Wait, what? No,
Right, yeah.
and then they want to
You're locked out. You're locked out of the system. No one will hire you with a criminal record. So even if you are dedicated to reforming your life and you want to make an effort towards making an honest living, if no one will hire you, people do eventually go back to crime because that's their only prospect. And then the state points to this and says, look, they just keep reoffending. So what's even the point in releasing them? We just need harsher penalties. Just lock them up, throw away the key.
And then you have
there is camaraderie in the streets too. I mean, if you get out of prison and everyone's treating you like garbage, you're going to be inclined to go back to that same group of friends that you were in trouble with or using with or whatever the case may be, a gang, because they treated you with kindness and acceptance.
And the problem is that the drug users, the drug users that come out of New York State prisons still have drug habits because amazingly, drugs are somehow still getting into the prison system. I wonder how that works. Okay. And the problem is that there's no true rehabilitation of people with drug problems. So what do you do with some, look, there's always a percentage of recidivism in the system. There are some people that's their lifestyle, and whether it was a conscious decision on their part, their upbringing, their general nature, whatever it happens to be, they commit crimes no matter what. Nothing you could do. Those people are possibly best served by, if they can't get the mental help, to be taken out of society because they're a hazard to society, to the average person on the street. But you look at that other 80 or 90%, like, are these really, people that need to be incarcerated for half their life or however long, and then basically tossed out to have no choice but to do it again? And
all right, hold on here though. We've got a dilemma, which is, like you said, we don't live in Libertopia. So within at least the narrow context of just the CO workers' strike, is there a libertarian solution to this, or did the governor do the best that someone could do in her position?
Here's the thing. One of the things we do need to define here is the fact that New York has quote unquote private prisons. That is absolutely not a free market thing, okay? They are state prisons that are run by corporations in order to make a profit. So what ends up happening here, and this is one of the things where you can say the argument can be made for the state to run it, because the state doesn't necessarily have the incentive to put more people in prison. You know what I mean? Not directly anyway, not through profit. But if you're a corporation who makes your income and your shareholders rich by putting people in prison, well, that's your incentive. Right or wrong, that's your incentive. And that's, people do what is in their best interests. And if your best interest is putting people in prison to make money, well, that's what tends to happen. And
there is a big prison lobby, and in many places in New York, it's the sole industry in the community.
Right. What kind of laws do you think that people who run private prisons are going to be lobbying for? Think they're think they want drug decriminalization? Probably not. This is a major issue, especially with libertarians, because we are advocates of free markets. We often get accused of wanting to privatize things. Now, there is a big difference between free markets and privatization. In privatization, what usually happens is state assets, such as in this case, prisons, are taken and sold off to private companies who are granted a sole monopoly, but they are still creations of the state. So in the case of prisons, okay, these are private companies. However, they exist because we have the state with all of these laws that they've put in place. and all of these people that, using their monopoly on the use of force, they have taken off the streets and forcibly imprisoned. And now they are selling the right to basically hold them captive and use them as slave labor to a supposedly private company that is granted a sole monopoly on the right to house them. Okay, like one of us could not just start a prison company and go and grab people off the street and hold them in cells. Like that is something that only the state can grant you the right to do. So like private in this particular case means practically nothing.
Well, it's crony capitalism at its worst.
Exactly. Yeah, this is like the prime example of crony capitalism.
It actually sounds like you guys are making the case for the state taking direct control over its prisons. And if you look at our platform, Bob, I don't know if you can throw it up on the screen, but I'm looking at it, and we say right in the preamble that if government has a purpose at all, it's to protect people's rights. So it sounds like libertarians agree that the state, if it's going to exist at all, at the very least has this as its primary function. So are we actually more comfortable with Hochul, say, nationalizing or statifying the prison system than we would be with the current system, where it's a sort of crony corporatist type of model?
If she was also protecting the rights of the prisoners. Because
Well, it
they have
sounds
rights.
like some of the things Bob was talking about when he was reading some of the articles are at least intended to protect the rights of
Sure.
special protected classes, right?
If you're outside of a prison, and no matter how poor or destitute you are, right, you would get Medicaid, and you could seek rehabilitation, mental health care, education. I mean, these are basic rights, right, in the state of New York. They're attainable. The state provides them to us. They do not provide them to prisoners. So it's one thing to take someone off the streets and protect us from them. It's another to strip them of all their basic rights and humanities, which they do in the prison. And I think that's why, as you guys all pointed out, once you go to prison, your life is changed forever. You're shunned, you're on the list, and all these things. You come out worse than you went in, right? Prison reform should look like the goal is they leave the prison a better person than they came in.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So
So
it should look like repealing as many laws as we can that incarcerate people who have not committed an act of aggression against anyone. So no more people ending up in prison because they didn't get a permit to run a business out of their house and then they couldn't afford to pay the fine, so eventually they were arrested and sentenced to prison. No more people going to prison because they were in possession of a chemical compound arbitrarily declared illegal by the state. The only people that would be in prison would be ones who actually have aggressed against others and needed to be separated from society. And in that case, there'd be fewer of them, so there would be more resources to dedicate to each person. So things like rehab and job training programs, education, it would be a lot easier to provide those things.
all right, I can hear libertarians in the audience reeing right now. So let me see if I got this right. The current system with some public-private partnerships is actually the worst of both worlds, according to what we've been saying. And we've got the state intervening with the workers' ability to do their job safely, and with the Taylor Law banning them from negotiating freely, for good working conditions and all that stuff. But it would actually get better if the state was running the prisons directly, and if we cut enough regulations so that the prison population, that the inmates, was smaller. Am I getting this right? Am I understanding this? Or
Because here's part of the problem. So how come if the prison guards are being run, if the prisons are being run by private corporations, that the prison guards are still subject to the Taylor Act? Because technically they wouldn't be public employees. Now, would they if they were actually being run in a private prison? Right? They would be private employees with a contract to the company that is employing them. But instead, the state wants it both ways. They want to have their cake and eat it too. Is that, well, no, it's going to be private, so we can go to everybody and say, see, we're not incarcerating all these people. It's a private company that takes care of this. But at the same time, oh no, you can't do anything because of the working conditions are so horrible that you don't want to be there anymore. Okay, and that is like the worst of both socialist type systems, because it's like, not only do they control the prison, which is the fascism part, right? Because that's control of an item that you don't directly own is fascism. But yeah, we're going to directly control the people that work there. Okay,
I don't know.
Keep them under the thumb.
It's just
I'm looking this up, and according to
responsibility, because like they have less direct control over it, because they're like, it's a private company, so we don't directly set prison policies. However, they still very much do. And yeah, the fact that prison guards are employees of the state is just further evidence of that fact.
They're not really
hold on.
private.
According to docs.newyork.gov, and I can drop this link in the chat, New York State corrections officers are public employees. They're employed by the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, which is a state agency. And then also, according to prisonpolicy.org, New York State prisons are primarily publicly run. Quote, the vast majority of correctional facilities in New York State are operated by the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. So while there might be some limited instances of privately run facilities for specific purposes, like halfway houses or specialized programs, the core prison system in New York is a government-run entity employing public employees.
And how is that possible when they tout, like every politician touts on the news, how New York State has this private prison system? Okay. See, this is where, so somebody's making money off of keeping people in jail, but has no responsibility for them whatsoever.
None. And who issues their W-2s, I wonder?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's another thing, like, because it's private, like that, it can be publicly traded. People can own shares of it, and the whole thing is just a money-making operation. Like, I mean, I've said it before.
Dare we say money laundering? I mean, it's...
Yeah, the prison system is just a gigantic loophole in the prohibition on slavery. Okay.
I agree.
You outlaw slavery, but then you make so many things illegal that you know there's going to be a steady stream of people coming into the prison system who you then can use for menial labor and pay them 25 cents an hour.
For sure.
Well, either way, whether it's a public system or a public-private partnership disguised as I don't know. To me, it sounds like statism or corporatism, and I hate both those things.
But the worst part about it is what happens, because again, I was before the pre-show we were talking about. Remember the famous case of the mentally ill person that went around stabbing people on the street? He had been released from mental hospitals repeatedly. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it wasn't just once. It was over and over and over again.
I want to say it was 12, Bob.
12? It was like...
I'm pretty sure it was 12.
Okay. But this is, whatever the number was, this person needs medical assistance. They have a problem, with their brain, with their mental facilities. And if they're not safe to release, you can't just release them into society. And the problem is, of course, the second that he kills somebody, like now all of a sudden, now you're going to prison for 50 years or whatever it happened to be. And okay, like, I tell you what, let's use an example, Dan. Let's say you raise a dog and you never punish them, and every time they poop in the house, you just let them back outside. This is actually from Robert Heinlein, the science fiction author. He uses this exact example. Okay, so every time he poops in the house, and you shouldn't do that, and you let him out, and it comes back, and he keeps doing it over and over again. Then one day you realize, he's all grown up, and he poops in the house, and you can pull out a gun and shoot him. Okay, is that a proper way to raise a dog? No,
I would say no.
No. Okay, and it's the same problem, is that you have people who have clear mental health issues. And what happens is, instead of working to get them mental health help, to get the drugs that they need to remain stable, to remain, mentally healthy, or at least as close as possible, and then unfortunately remove those that cannot be made safe for the general public. Okay, they just wait until they actually do some horrific crime or hurt somebody, or here's a popular one in New York: push people
Bob,
off subway
we've got
platforms in front of
libertarians
oncoming trains.
we,
Then
we have more reading in the audience because we on this very podcast have advocated for the separation of pre-crime from actual crime. So if you have people who are doing things that indicate they might commit more serious crimes in the future, you're saying that that's grounds to throw them in jail.
I'm saying that that's grounds to get them mental health help.
Aha. So in the form that we do it nowadays, mental health, though, often involves a form of incarceration and forced medication. We've talked about that.
Specialized prisons. If we're going to have all these prisons, and there's too many prisoners, and I agree with Rose 100%.
I think we can get around a lot of this by just legalizing self-defense, which in New York State, we are one of the worst states for the ability to defend yourself. If people some crazy person attacks you on the street, you defend yourself, and then you're subjected to not only a murder trial, but potentially, you could end up in prison for having defended yourself,
or others like Daniel Penny.
I think there's a lot of people, though, nowadays
who was ultimately acquitted, but he spent time in jail. He had to go through the whole trial process. It cost him how much money? And he's also still subjected to civil trials, which is ridiculous. But
all right, how about Bernie Goetz? Okay, because they convicted Bernie Goetz. It took them 6 trials to do it. It took them bypassing the grand jury. Okay, and they made sure to convict him. It was and I've met the man in person. He's not violent. He was a really sweet, quiet guy. But you know what happens is that you get to a point where you can't take it anymore. You're not going to deal with it. And this is, like you said, Marvin Niemeyer is the perfect example here. And this is, the state is scared to death of people like them because again, if one person does it, they'll be castigated and imprisoned or, made to look as a lunatic.
Yeah.
But what happens?
Check on your welfare friends. Ask to see the garage.
Yeah. What happens if 1,000 people do it? See, the state's terrified of stuff like that.
That's why they want to make an example of people. They don't want people knowing that you can defend yourself. Okay, they want you to believe that you have to have the state. Oh, we have to have
right
police
to defend
because
yourself.
we have to have police because otherwise some crazy person might break into my house and murder me. Okay. Can't have people knowing that they could protect themselves. Can't have people have the right to defend their property if some person comes into their house uninvited in the first place.
There's nuance here, though, and I think libertarians are often falsely accused of asserting that we don't need police or anything. We should just have everybody armed to the teeth, and that's not what we want. I don't imagine my elderly mother, walking around packing, although I can imagine some. My point is, I think that we want to reserve the right to defend ourselves, and we want to live in a functional society where the need to actually do that is probably, fairly small. But I think if given the choice, there are a lot of voters in New York who have demonstrated that they would rather choose to be disarmed and incapable of self-defense on the understanding that the government will provide defense for them. So would prison reform, like what we're discussing, tonight, would prison reform address that concern? Would it make people more safe, or would it result in less safety?
Well, see, it depends on how you define prison reform. Because again, prison reform without crime and I don't want to use the word punishment, but consequences results. See, this is where the libertarian position of being able to freely defend yourself, and we're talking reasonable people, okay? The average person on the street, where criminals commit crimes because they know that people won't defend themselves or can't. Okay? But if they knew that, let's say on the average block of 10 houses, 7 out of 10 of those people owned some means of defense, and I'm not necessarily saying a firearm, but some means of defense, that they were taking a risk of being carried out of that house. It's what you incentivize is what you get.
Yeah, but you're very artfully dodging the question, Bob.
No, I'm not. It's like what happens is if you incentivize people not taking action against criminals or crime having consequences, what you get is more crime. Okay?
All right, so in our platform, we say that we can delegate that authority to defense.
You can.
Right, so, Rose,
Oh,
what
go
would
ahead.
you say? Well, I was just going to say, we can delegate that right to defense. So even if my mom isn't going to, shoot the purse snatcher, some entity, some group within our community has the right to, protect her from that.
Right. I want to be able to go to work and not have to worry that my house is going to get broken into because I'm not personally there to defend it. So yes, communities should be able to collectively decide, like, okay, do we want to hire private security to defend our homes? And if we're out walking, they'll provide security if someone runs in and tries to attack us. Like, they'll be monitoring the area and protecting us from aggressors. Or do we want to have like a neighborhood watch type system where
why not have your mom looking out the window, keep an eye on the neighborhood?
Oh, she does. And once those perpetrators are taken off the streets, they have to go somewhere.
Well,
right?
Okay. In a stateless, decentralized society where communities are community owned or privately owned, basically covenant communities, such people would eventually just be cast out of the community. So where do they go? Well, what would likely happen is a person, because they've done things like robbed people or otherwise just been someone who can't be, who has been had their right to be in a particular community revoked, eventually they'd have nowhere to go, except you'd have, what would probably happen is you'd have these rehab type facilities pop up. Okay, you're a liability. No one wants to have you in their community. You have nowhere to go, except, okay, we'll provide you with a place to sleep and we'll give you 3 meals a day, but in return, okay, you'll provide menial labor for us. So they'd be kind of like prisons, except they'd be voluntary because people who voluntarily checked into them would have no place to go. But
you don't think that people would form criminal undergrounds in areas where
the gangs?
Hold on.
The private cops didn't reach.
No. Tell you what,
the neighborhoods are poor and they can't afford it.
What is the definition of an outlaw?
It's somebody who is outside the jurisdiction of what we're talking about.
But actually, that's not where that term began.
It means that you're outside the king's peace.
Right. Which means that you are outside of the king's protection as well. Mm-hmm. And that's what it originally meant. So the whole Robin Hood thing of being an outlaw not only means that you are outside the king's law, but it means that you receive no protection whatsoever. And if somebody wants to beat you up, take your stuff, do whatever, you have, by your own actions, put yourself in that position. Now, I'm not advocating for that, but that's what outlaw used to mean, is that it was much more serious than people think it is today. Is that when you're an outlaw, that means if a bunch of the farmers with shotguns decide they're going to get rid of you because you've been stealing their stock and they're unhappy about it, nobody's going to lift a finger to help you.
So let's consider which populations would end up outlawed, though. I know you're not advocating for this, but in a way, I'm actually kind of sympathetic to it because it's the most anarchist system and I'm an anarchist. But if we think about which populations are going to end up like that, it's the ones Karyn was talking about, the vulnerable people who have mental health problems, drug addiction problems. Maybe they've made some bad choices and they ought to be responsible for them. But as those things chain together and their lives get worse and worse and worse, it gets harder and harder for them to pull themselves out without help. Isn't a statist system like the one we have in New York, at least if they put the resources they need into rehab and, that type of thing.
See, that's the thing.
Isn't
That's
that more
the
humane?
goal of the system, but how it's actually executed is pretty much the exact opposite. Because
people should be sent to particular prisons based on their crime.
Yeah.
Like, we should have prisons that are just for, like, you were in a gang, right? And that prison would be, I don't know, educational, I want to say. Like, you would have a prison designated just for rehabilitating people who are in gangs. Most people join gangs when they're kids, by the way. So, give them a shot. Or one for the people with mental illness, or one for the people with drug problems, or one for people who grew up, like, I don't know, like, every prisoner should be evaluated and sent to the appropriate facility.
I guess I naively assumed, without really looking into it, that is the system. Don't we have maximum security prisons?
No, that's it, because
That's for the protection of
white-collar
staff, not the prisoners.
I think it kind of depends. I mean, like, okay, some of it is dependent on what type of crime you've committed, but yeah, like, it's like, you have victimless crime, people convicted of victimless crimes, and people who committed actual crimes with victims thrown together. It's also based on, like, how much of a risk they are
I
of
can tell you in my
escaping
counties
or attacking guards or whatever.
these prisons are just all one size fits all. They throw everybody in a cell, and it doesn't matter what. You could be right next to somebody who's a murderer and a violent gang criminal, because again, it's a time, space, and money issue of because of the way the state runs it, and they throw everybody in prison. And this is where the system takes a person who might have committed what we as libertarians would consider a relatively minor crime, or even no crime at all, and put them in with hardened criminals who have been doing this for years and have no intention of ever stopping. Okay, and now you have to survive, right? This is you don't visit prison. You try to survive it. And that's part of the problem, is that with that many violent people, either you become violent or you become dead, and or the victim. You know what I mean? Like
right. People join gangs in prison because otherwise they'll be beaten
for self-defense,
up constantly. Yeah.
Sure.
Sounds like a miniature system of why we have states in the first place.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Well, this is
so. It sounds like what we're getting at is a much wider systemic reform to the justice system. And as sympathetic as I am to the need for that, more arbitration, more people, making good, on their sins to the people who they actually victimized, rather than, going to prison or whatever. As important as all of that is, within the context of the actual prison strike, if we don't have all these other changes and we're just stuck with the system we have, do we agree that the governor has handled things relatively well? I mean, what could she do better?
In the worst possible manner.
No, I mean, how can she say? Yeah, how can she say that her National Guard members were put in harm's way? That is an acknowledgement that the corrections officers were in harm's way.
Yeah,
how funny that she said that out loud to the media. That's astounding to me, and I love it. But, I mean, we have victimless child rapists serve 2 or 3 years, and we still have people in prison from the 1994 crime bill who were, like, selling pot. The reform goes so much deeper than those buildings we call prisons. Like, I wouldn't put those buildings anywhere near the top of the list at this point. It's such a mess.
Oh, I agree with you. But again, what can somebody do? Like, if you were elected governor tomorrow with the political situation as it is, what would you really have the leeway to even be able to change? You might be able to negotiate with the COs. You might be able to, change working conditions or pay. But what more could you really do?
They need to change the self-defense rules. Because this is the root cause. Everybody likes to dance around the subject and play games with, we could do this with the prisons and that with the prisons. But until people are legitimately allowed to defend themselves, you're going to end up in, and stop with the non-violent, non-victim crimes. You're just going to keep having this population that keeps rolling over in the prison system. They're going to go in a minor criminal in prison. They're going to learn all the techniques now, that because they're already going to have, you know what a B number is? That's the number assigned to you when you get arrested in New York State. That stays with you for life. Never goes away, right? I think did they ever pass the law about letting you own a gun once you've served for felonies? I forget if that ever was passed in New York or not. But at one
No.
point, you could never own a gun once you've been convicted of a felony.
I believe that's still true.
And here's the problem, is
Isn't
that there
that
are
going to the
felonies
Supreme
and there are
Court?
felonies, okay? Because a felony with violence and gun use, yes, absolutely, because now you've broken a major law. You're willing to hurt other people using a firearm, so maybe you not having a firearm is kind of a good thing. But by the same token, New York will, well, you know, remember certain 32 felonies convictions in New York that, you know, really weren't legitimate. And how do we, you know, so we're saying that the now president of the United States can't own a gun in New York because they've been convicted of 32 felonies. Like,
Well, I was
what?
just going to say, when you give the government the ability to rationalize taking away rights, then it's just a matter of bureaucratic formalities for them to come up with a reason to take away your rights.
Exactly. Again, incentive.
You know?
It's all incentives.
Yeah. So it
We have
really
a lot
seems
of
like we're coming back.
victimless felonies, like actual felonies that are completely victimless.
Yes.
Bail jumping's a
Yeah.
felony.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, it feels like we're coming back to the unfortunate reality that a lot of problems don't really have libertarian solutions because they're downstream of so many of the problems that are caused by statism in the
Right.
first place, that the only real solution is libertarianism.
At the end of the day, yeah, like these prison guards, okay. Yeah, the problems that they're experiencing in the prisons they work in are downstream from all the problems that we just discussed. However, yeah, at the end of the day, okay, if they don't feel like they can do their job safely and they have enough like-minded people who agree with them, like they do have the right to strike if they want to. Now, the company they work for, in this case, it's the state, does have the right to fire them if they want. It becomes an issue, though, when you've got public sector employees because they become increasingly difficult to fire, and also the state can keep them on the on their payroll indefinitely because they have the infinite money cheat. But in general, yes, people do have the right to unionize. They do have the right to strike. It becomes a lot stickier when you get into public sector unions because those are jobs that in an ideal libertarian society would not exist in the first place.
Well, I have a couple of points about this, though. First of all, the interesting part is that the whole public employees not being able to be fired, that's kind of a double-edged sword because the governor can get ticked off, turn around and fire the whole lot of you, and nobody blinks an eye. This is a problem right off the bat because they use things like the Taylor law to basically make you a slave to the system. That's the first problem. Because look at those 2,000 and realize that 2,000 or more corrections officers, COs, that's why everybody calls them COs, they're corrections officers, okay, literally walked away from their career. They said, this is so bad that, you know what, I'm good with walking away and doing something else in my life because it was
But
just
you wonder
that
how
bad.
old those 2,000 were. You know, I would think that out of those 2,000, not very many of them were young men with families.
I don't know. Some of them are getting, you know, they're again, a lot of the law enforcement community is ready to hire them on. So, you know, that was.
Maybe. I feel like they were forced back to work. I mean, basically.
What was the other point I was trying to make? There was that aspect of it, and then I'll have to come back to it. I'll remember what it was, but the state having control over all of this and having these laws. Oh, and the National Guard is part two, because realize that politicians don't look at downstream consequences. They don't think that far enough ahead, except for very, very rare exceptions. They don't think that far enough ahead. You've got 6,000 National Guard people working in prisons. Do you think they're happy? How many of those National Guard are going to re-up at the end of their term?
Well,
Because if they know they're going back
contract.
to a prison to work as a corrections officer, where corrections officers found the conditions so bad that 2,000 of them chucked their whole careers, okay, would you re-up? So now what happens to New York and the recruitment, this is again, it's kind of a microcosm of what happened in the U.S. military, where recruitment was at the lowest level in what, 40 years, 50 years, whatever it was some ridiculous number. Okay. But once somebody was put in place that people believed was a reasonable leader for the military, all of a sudden recruitment rebounded immediately, like literally within weeks. The recruitment jumped back up because, again, it's all incentives. If you're being told to do something that you're going to find morally repugnant, very dangerous, and basically being ordered to do it by people you aren't sure know how to tie their own shoes, what is your reaction going to be? And I know what mine would be, because it was like, that's crazy. Like, then what happens, 6 months down the road, a year down the road? And how is the governor going to recruit new corrections officers? How is that going to work? Because, again, they literally gave like the perfect demonstration of why you should not take on a New York corrections officer as a career. So, I mean, if they put out ads to say don't become New York residents, they couldn't do a better job. It's really, this is what's nuts about this whole situation, is that look at the downstream effects of what they're doing, and how is that going to affect the correction system going forward?
Right. No, you bring up an interesting point, because part of the reason why they don't really need to try to negotiate with the people who are currently striking, because they have the ability to bring in military service people,
armed troops,
cannot quit their jobs because they signed a contract saying that they cannot back out of the contract they signed, or they'll be thrown in prison. So such contracts are inherently illegitimate per libertarian standards. However, they do exist. We have the state, which has the monopoly on force, upholding them. Yes. So, yeah.
But here's my question: Are the National Guard troops armed?
Probably. Yes. Like we have. Basically, you have less incentive to try to negotiate with the people who are on strike if you can just call in people who, under no circumstances, can quit their jobs and they can't refuse your orders.
But again, see, you can't have guns in a prison. You know what I'm saying? Like, the only people that have guns in prison are people that are isolated from the prisoners, because you can't take the chance.
I doubt they're armed on the prison tiers.
I don't think so. Most of the time, this is part of the problem of being a corrections officer, is that, as far as I'm aware, corrections officers are not armed with lethal firearms, because if there was an incident, prisoners could get hold of those firearms. So you don't arm corrections officers. The ones that are armed are like the guys in the towers and all of that. They're armed so that in case the prisoners were to break out, they would shoot them and, keep them from escaping the prison. But again, you're bringing people, the National Guard's job is to kill people. Okay, when you strip away all the secondary and all the stuff of helping everybody, their job is, in an armed insurrection or an invasion, is to kill people. That's their job. That's the same job as the U.S. military has. Okay, so what are you going to do when you take away their guns? They're not trained for this.
Mm-hmm. No, not at all.
And again, people think that the National Guard is some kind of weird catch-all they're going to sweep the streets next, or they're going to pick up the garbage. Is that like the idea here? Because it doesn't work. The people that are in the military have a mental picture of what their job is supposed to be. Okay. And what happens is, just like we found out in the U.S. military, is when you change that job to something that they don't agree with, that they don't believe should be their job, they leave. You know what I mean? They just don't want to deal with it because, no, I want it to be, whatever, protecting the country or protecting my state in case of armed incursions or whatever. And now you're telling me I've got to guard criminals at, like I said, it's a joke. If you look up sometime the pay for National Guard, because it's a part-time job, it's, again, most of these people have jobs. This is, it's supposed to be like the 2 weeks and, 2 weeks and every 1 weekend a month or whatever it is. And now you're taking them and putting them in this extremely volatile situation with people that can be extremely violent given the appropriate circumstances. And again, now my question is, are they retaining their guns, or are they going to be put into the prison system with no arms and told to keep control of unruly prison population, whom by the way you can't put in solitary confinement. You have to protect the vulnerable. Like that phrase, really, the vulnerable population. Would somebody please define that for me?
I'm dying to know who they are.
Yeah, I want to know what the vulnerable population is, because that's just
Old
like
people. It's got to be the medical. I don't know. That's a great question.
No, they're probably members of certain categories that the state of New York has deemed protected.
But again, this is so. What's happening here is they're creating all of this chaos. Okay, this like situation that they may or may not be able to control down the road. But nobody thinks about that because they're politicians. So they just like, oh no, we can just bring in, whatever. Well, okay. Yeah. Would you, again, would you bring in the postmen to be corrections officers? Because they don't have the training either. You know what I'm saying? Like, again, as a National Guardsman, okay, you'll go and help people when there's a flood and all that stuff. Because that's kind of, you want to be the white knight. You want to be the guy who's going to protect people and protect civilization. But
the military would have some
like MPs and
stuff
like that, some people. But right, yeah. But to bring in 6,000 National Guardsmen to do that, I would say to you that they're not trained for it. They're not equipped for it. And I think most of them don't want to do it. Okay. So what happens inside the prison now? See, this what I'm saying. There's all these unknowns that you're creating by having this whole situation happen. And
the unintended consequences. And they love that, the politicians love ignoring the law of unintended consequences. And again, what happens if they can't hire new corrections officers? They just won't do the job. Or again, the prisoners have now seen what happens when the conditions get bad enough. So do you think they're just going to try and make it worse deliberately? Well, see, this is like when you start, this is one thing libertarians are kind of good at, is looking beyond the right now. Okay? When you take decisions, and especially when it comes to the military, okay? Because there was a phrase by a famous author I love to read, is that when you send somebody in with a gun, you've created a statesman, whether you think so or not. And they're going to do whatever it takes to protect themselves, right? Because what's their number one job? Just like law enforcement, my job is to go home at the end of the day. They don't care about anything else, and quite frankly, they don't care who else outside of their little group gets hurt doing so, because job one is go home at the end of the day.
I've done jobs in screwed up systems. I mean, when the system is so fucked up, you can't actually change it meaningfully yourself. And when your life and your livelihood depend on you having that job in a bad economy, you're stuck. I can see why people would do that. And I think it brings us back to the fact that this may be a situation where we don't have perfect libertarian solutions. But before I give my take on what we can actually take away from this, before we wrap up, does anybody else have any closing thoughts or things that we should have examined a little bit more deeply?
Oh, really?
The biggest one is the whole thing kind of stems. The root cause is the fact that New Yorkers are basically prohibited from defending themselves.
Yep,
Because
we
that-
can't defend ourselves, and too many things are illegal or heavily
right, and
regulated.
the regulations are so incredibly, insanely over the top. You know,
You can't not break laws. So there's, yeah. If the state wants to come after you, it will, and it will find a reason to. So
you need a license in New York to be a florist. Like, how much over the top is that?
You need a license to take someone else's dog for a walk in exchange for financial compensation. Yeah, and yeah, you can in theory be fined. And if you can't pay the fine, you could, in theory, end up in the prison system if you can't, because you walked other people's dogs and they paid you for it, and you didn't have the permission slip from the state. So yes, let people defend themselves, so that we don't have to rely on the state to remove dangerous individuals from society, and also deregulate the economy, let people make a living, let people do business, let people indulge in whatever chemical substances they want if they're not hurting anyone else in the process. And then you'll reduce the prison population. You won't have these overworked, overstressed guards complaining about unsafe working conditions.
That's the thing is, if you let somebody just do work, okay, if they're working and earning a living for themselves, they're usually not committing crimes.
Mm-hmm.
So by just backing off some of the regulations, you'll take some of the crime off the streets. Why? Because if somebody can do that, look, if they have an addiction and it's terrible, but they'll walk your dog and you give them $10. Hey, what they do with the money is kind of their issue, but they're not committing a crime, right? They're not mugging 75-year-old ladies for their purse, for their $10, okay? And overall, that helps bring this cycle of violence, which is another lovely politician phrase. It reduces that because people are working and doing things rather than standing around looking for victims.
Right. If running a business out of my house is going to cost me thousands of dollars in licensing fees, and if I can even get approved, because maybe my house is not zoned for commercial use, so I'd have to buy a new house on a property zoned for commercial use in the first place. If that's one of my options, or my other option is, or I could just sell this black market product under the table, don't have to pay taxes on it, and I don't have to worry about getting the correct permission slips. Like, what is someone who does not have the money up front to do to get the necessary licensing and do things above ground going to do? Like, they are much more likely to get involved in a black or gray market business.
Because that's the incentive. This is what the state incentivizes people to break the law, which the law is, I have to put it in quotes because those aren't, again, laws are supposed to prevent people from hurting other people.
It punishes you for being productive.
Right.
It disincentivizes you from being productive by requiring high licensing fees and other ridiculous, unnecessary certifications. And it punishes you for working by taking, in New York State, at least a third of what you make out in taxes.
At least.
Okay, there is huge incentive for wanting to make your money under the table.
Yep.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I'm glad you guys raised all that. I think that puts a pretty fine point on what really needs to be done to solve this issue.
Regulate and shrink the power of the state, and this problem should resolve itself.
Arm the moms.
Arm the mobs.
The only bright part of this that I can see is that at some point, the general population begins to click for them. Was it Millie in was it Argentina or Venezuela, wherever it was, right? All of a sudden they go,
Malay? Yeah.
yeah, Malay,
In Argentina, yeah.
Argentina, right? So that all of a sudden the people are like, we have to do something different. And that's when you get somebody like that. And when people see the positive results, all of a sudden they begin to realize.
Yeah, but there's also Bukele in El Salvador who got real draconian on his armed gangs and cleaned everything up, and he's damn popular now.
Well, those are the two ends of the spectrum, right? Because that's what happens, one or the other. And this is, do we really want that second one?
Oh, I like Bukele. He's very, he likes Bitcoin, and so do I. But that's another conversation.
But again, this is where, okay, you could either have the military in the streets with guns, keeping the population under control, or you can have the population productive and working, and the government's staying out of it, and have, in my opinion, a much more productive and happy society, so that we're getting stuff done rather than.
I think people settle for Bukele, or at least they think what they want is Bukele when they don't understand Millet.
Because the idea of he's going to clean up all this gang violence is appealing when you don't understand what is driving the gang violence. Mm-hmm. Like the idea of deregulation and shrinking the power of the state. It sounds very counterintuitive to people who have grown up all their life thinking they needed the state to protect them. It's like the idea of deregulating the economy sounds crazy to people who are like, but wait, the state is the one thing protecting us from abusive working conditions and corporations dumping toxic chemicals into our water supplies and labeling cyanide tablets as baby candy and selling them.
When we talk about private prisons, I think about the mines, right? Like, oh God, someone's going to be sold into the salt mines and they're just going to be worked to death. And like, there's historical precedent for what happens when private companies are in charge of incarceration.
Company towns, basically. And
but when you actually dive into the historical precedents, which don't worry, I'm not going to do, it's almost always a crony corporatism, where the state monopoly on violence is actually what's backing up that entire system. And it wouldn't have evolved in the first place, nor would it have been able to continue profitably without the state and its monopoly on violence.
Because
people get that backwards. They think the state is what protects them from corporate control, when in actuality, the state is the reason why there are giant corporations controlling things.
Well, what happens is when in a libertarian system, okay, when a corporation does things you don't like, people quit. They leave. They just go away. And now all of a sudden the corporation can't find anybody to work for them, and they're crying the blues. But what happens is, the state comes in and, gee, like this, you're going to be in the union whether you like it or not, and you're going to work for this wage whether you like it or not, and you will pretend, because I've actually seen live union negotiations, and I'm not saying all of them are like it, but they kind of go into a room with the state or the other people, and they work out a deal. And they don't tell the membership the deal they're working out or why they're working it out, because it's not in your benefit. And this is where the corporations can become so large and so crony, okay, because the state has so much power to enforce its will. And this is the big problem that Millet is going to run into, is that what happens when you try to reduce the power of the state? And the answer is that they're going to make sure that they have violence and that they regain that control, because they want to be in control. It's just about control. That's all it is.
Right. You'll have these entities that were for so long propped up by the state that they gained a considerable amount of power on their own. And they're not going to just disappear.
Just going to roll over, right? And this is
why, crony corporations need to just be treated as extensions of the state. So if you talk about abolishing the state, you are by extension talking about the crony corporations that are subsidized and propped up by the state. Because otherwise, they will just become the new state once the actual state is out of the picture.
Well, that's the thing, is the state keeps them in power. So, again, if this is where, like, Millet had a point, is just privatize it all now. Do it. Boom, done. Because, again, now, how do you go to the state for to protect yourself when the state doesn't, or doesn't have the power to do so anymore? And that's where, like I said, these corporations and I have to say, the policing in the prisons, it's the same kind of deal. They're playing both sides of the coin, because the state runs it all, pretends that it doesn't, and then somebody's making huge money on this, and that's crazy. And the incentive then is to put lots more people in prison until the system collapses. And we saw a taste of that. We saw a taste of that last month. And I would not be at all surprised if it doesn't happen again, and worse.
All right, folks. As we wrap up our look at this New York prison worker situation and all the related and associated issues,
And there's a lot.
let me see if I can zoom out and consider the fundamental principles at play and really put this to bed. So we've heard the details, the grievances, the state's response, but from a truly libertarian standpoint, what's the real takeaway? I think it's the inherent failure of the state to manage something as complex and sensitive as incarceration. The state, with its monopoly on force and its bureaucratic inertia, is simply not equipped to handle this effectively. We see the consequences: understaffing, unsafe conditions, and a system that often seems to punish both the inmates and the very people tasked with maintaining order. I mean, look at the poor National Guard, right? The state dictates the terms of employment for the people who are supposed to do the job, the COs. They dictate the rules within the walls, and they even try to dictate how labor disputes should be resolved. This top-down control breeds resentment and inefficiency and danger to everyone involved, from the COs to the inmates and to society at large, when inmates are released unreformed and more hardened than ever as criminals. And then they're deprived of opportunities to work their way back into normal society anyway. So, what else are they going to do, right? The libertarian solution, if I understand you guys right, in its purest form, would be to dismantle this state monopoly and allow self-defense and the delegation of the aspects of defense, such as what to do with dangerous criminals, not nonviolent, victimless criminals. In other words, to allow a truly free market to step in, not crony corporatism. Imagine private security firms competing to provide safety, private companies managing facilities with an eye towards efficiency and humane treatment, all governed by voluntary contracts to hold them accountable. Outlaws and criminals would be incentivized to rehabilitate themselves by either going along with that process or remaining totally outside society and its protections. And in an armed society, well, you can imagine what would happen to such people. Now, truly violent and dangerous individuals who've proven themselves unwilling to respect the rights of others would find themselves either dead or in the hands of private professional prisons. Now, I know some people in the audience might be thinking that sounds a bit radical or even unrealistic. That's Ancapistan, not, Libertopia. And perhaps it's a bit hard to imagine, given what we've all been conditioned to believe is normal here in the Empire State of New York. But look at the current situation. Is the state's approach working? Are the prisons safe? Are the workers satisfied? The answer, judging by the headlines, seems to be a resounding no. And even if we don't go full anarcho-capitalist, the libertarian critique remains potent. We should be pushing for greater individual liberty, less government intervention, and more market-based solutions whenever possible. This means questioning the state's role in the prison system, advocating for the rights of workers to negotiate freely by repealing the Taylor Act, and scrutinizing any government actions that restrict individual freedoms, whether those of the incarcerated or the employed. The New York prison situation, in my opinion, is a microcosm of a larger problem, though. It's not going to be solved until we solve this larger problem, which is the state's tendency to overreach and its ineffective attempts to solve problems through force and bureaucracy. A truly libertarian approach demands we rethink the very foundations of how we deal with crime and punishment. It's about empowering individuals, not empowering the state. And that, my friends, I think is a conversation worth continuing, but maybe another time. So good night, everyone.
Good night.
Where will you be when the order is given to censor your mind as free speech is forbidden, as martyrs for peace from the world will be driven away by the sound of a bellowing thunder and choke on the blood of a dream going under? Tear up our Constitution, and from every direction we cry revolution, standing together and without permission, soldiers for truth in the war of attrition, the love of our country as our ammunition. I'm a long, long way from my home, and I'm going to change all the things I find strange, for I am not